This is a recording of Dr. Samir Gandesha at the Sunday, March 13, 2016 meeting of the BC Humanist Association in Vancouver. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the BCHA or its board of directors. To learn more about humanism and to support our work, visit bchumanist.ca and be sure to subscribe to the BC Humanist podcast on Stitcher or iTunes. If you would like to help us produce this podcast and to make better recordings in the future, email info@bchumanist.ca.
Well, thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here this morning. I'm especially delighted to see such an amazing turnout just as we've sprung forward. It's always a little bit more of a challenge to adjust ourselves once we set the clocks ahead. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge, as I customarily do, that this event is taking place on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh nations. Really, I wanted to just start out in a kind of conversational way and then move on to my prepared remarks. And the prepared remarks are really part of a larger essay that I'm working on. And I'd be very happy to hear your feedback because it's not really a specialized contribution. It is really meant for the general public. And I think it would be really great to hear what you think about it. I myself am not completely convinced by my own argument, so I'd like to have some feedback and really try and make it a little bit more convincing at the end of the day. I would like to just begin by asking whether you in this group have had much discussion of the new atheism. My guess is you probably have, but I'd like to just ask and what people think the new atheism is. Can anybody give me a kind of succinct definition of what that is?
I think it's kind of a science-based epistemology that's coming predominantly from a lot of people who have advanced degrees in science. And then, of course, there are people like Christian Hitchens and great journalists and atheists. So there's kind of a merger between science and some great writers.
Excellent. I think this is a very, very good, succinct way of putting it. So the new atheists really consisted primarily the four horsemen of the new atheist apocalypse, as it were. I think they refer to themselves, or other journalists refer to them as such. You have Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and, as you say, Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens, who used to be really very much on the left, and then over the course of the previous 2 or 3 decades has moved, I'd say 2 decades, has moved in a very different direction. One could say that one of the events that has sort of prompted him to move in this direction, I would think, was the 1989 fatwa issued against Salman Rushdie, and I think Hitchens was quite appalled at that at the response from the left, who were really kind of falling over themselves not to upset anybody. And I think that this is an interesting aspect of the background to the new atheism. One thing, though, that troubles me a little bit about the new atheism is that it is primarily, as was said, epistemologically oriented. That is to say, it's based on a theory of knowledge, and it basically wants to make the argument. It does make arguments that, from a cognitive standpoint, that is to say, from the standpoint oriented towards justifiable truth claims, religion simply is wrong. Right? It's factually incorrect, and it's internally incoherent. And therefore, we just simply must move beyond it. And what worries me about this is that it doesn't take into account, let's say, rather than the epistemological problem of religion, and that certainly is one dimension of it, an important one. It doesn't look at the ontological dimensions of religion, and by that I mean ontology is a study of reality, a subfield in philosophy. Metaphysics in particular is oriented towards understanding the nature of reality, and ontology generally fits under metaphysics. Ontology can also be understood in terms of existence, right? And you have figures like Jean-Paul Sartre as a existentialist, as a phenomenologist, as an ontologist, in the sense that he wants to try and understand the nature of human being. Right? So what worries me is that in the New Atheism there's not really a deep attempt to understand why it is that people are so driven to religious worldviews, religious explanations of the world. And I think if you want to move in a direction beyond those worldviews, one has to get to grips with what the appeal is, what kind of a need is being satisfied by religion. It's not simply a matter of giving better arguments, but also so at the level of epistemology, but rather understanding the ontological conditions, right? The ontological needs of people that lead them in the direction of religion. And so, in some ways, the talk is an attempt to say that we can maybe try and pose these questions in trying to understand the phenomena of suicide bombing, for example, as the most extreme form of religious adherence and action, practice, in a sense. And so I think this is maybe where the humanities tradition can come in to play a role, and that will be my argument. But before I go there, I just want to talk about three figures who inform in different ways the argument that I made, who are really very key to the tradition of the modern humanities, and that's Marx, Nietzsche, Freud. What do we know about Marx, quickly? Can anybody identify a quote, for example, that might be specifically geared to religion from Marx?
Yeah, but that's
the opium of the masses.
Opium of the
but
masses.
that's always short. You have to take the full quote.
Exactly. This is very good. This is very good. Okay, we'll talk about that in a second. Nietzsche. What did Nietzsche say?
God is dead.
God is dead. Very good. And then, what about Freud? How did Freud?
Rejection of a father figure.
Rejection of father figure. Okay, very good. You're very much up to speed here. So, Marx, from his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, which he wrote between 1843 and 1844, religious suffering is, at one and the same time, the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of people. So Marx is trying to identify the way in which religion can't be in a way understood on its own terms, but rather must be traced to the social material conditions that give rise to suffering, which then gives rise to the need for an answer to that suffering, for a way to make that suffering in some way meaningful. Right? There's nothing worse than unexplained or unaccountable suffering. Right? So that's Marx. Friedrich Nietzsche, from The Gay Science, published in 1882. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderer of all murderers? How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderer of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives? Who will wipe this blood off of us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? Okay? Nietzsche. Basically arguing that what has held culture together theretofore, so back to the time of the late 19th century, was some idea of God. And now God has been undermined through various means, particularly through modern science, and we now confront a kind of crisis. I'll talk a little bit about that in my own talk. And then this is a long quote from Freud, just essentially arguing that religion is something that human beings come to adhere to for various reasons, because of the fear of an overwhelming external nature, and also due to the fact that the civilization which is built up in order for us to deal with that external nature imposes its own forms of renunciation on us. And religion is a way of accounting for that. Religion ultimately is a way of dealing with human suffering, human finitude, or the fact that human beings are mortal beings, don't have an immortal soul, as religions have said, and even as Plato thought. So those are the quotes. So you go through just giving you a taste. And those are the three figures that in different ways inform what I'm going to say. So I'm going to now turn just to my text, and then we'll have a discussion to follow. But while I'm going through this, if there's something that strikes you as particularly not understandable, you can ask for a clarification. But I would prefer the questions at the end. So, it is a deep irony that the humanities are in the state of crisis that they are in today. For decades now, they have been on the defensive, particularly vis-a-vis the so-called STEM disciplines: science, technology, engineering, and math. At first glance, it's not difficult to see why. Unlike the humanities and social sciences, STEM disciplines provide tangible improvements in the quality of human life. Science, medical science in particular, has helped to drastically reduce infant mortality and has prolonged life expectancy. Digital technology, specifically the invention of the microchip processor, has revolutionized life in a manner that rivals, if not exceeds, the impact of the Industrial Revolution over 200 years ago. Innovations in engineering have enabled us, for example, to conquer time and to master space to a hitherto breathtakingly unprecedented extent. Mathematics, of course, underlies each of these other three disciplines. Yet, all of these benefits have not been without their own specific costs in terms of the negative disruptions to human society. So there's a good side and a bad side. Some of these disruptions and dislocations can only, in a sense, be understood and addressed by the very disciplines that are in crisis, the very humanistic disciplines that are in crisis. And I mean by this, of course, philosophy, history, comparative literature, political science, anthropology, all of these social and humanistic sciences, right? The so-called soft sciences, if you will. So these sciences, in a sense, are required to understand some of these disruptions, but at the same time, they have now been increasingly marginalized. So the crisis of the humanities has been widely discussed over the past 2 decades or so, but has been made no clearer, perhaps, than in Japan recently, in which the new conservative Abe government has issued, despite the opposition of the heads of many Japanese corporations, a directive to universities to jettison their faculties of humanities and social sciences and simply just get rid of them. Certain universities, such as the prestigious University of Tokyo, courageously have refused to go along, but this has been the exception rather than the rule. Is it a matter of time before this kind of drastic moves finds a wider resonance throughout the Western world? Already we have seen in our own province the Christie Clark government reorienting higher education around training specifically geared to what was supposed to be a burgeoning L&G sector as opposed to liberal arts education. Of course, what was not taken adequately into account was the question of what happens when such sectors experience a downturn, which is what is happening exactly now. And what then are those who have specific training geared to that industry to do? One reason why CEOs of major corporations, as those I just referred to, referenced in Japan, favor humanistic or liberal arts educations is, of course, that employees who are educated rather than trained in liberal arts is that they are able to adapt and change to what is often a rapidly fluctuating and fluid economic and social environment. All this notwithstanding, what could be some of the implications of this marginalization of the humanities to address some of the key challenges facing our societies. I say that the crisis of the humanities is ironic because these disciplines have never been more important just at the moment of their imminent demise, precisely because they apparently contribute little, if anything, to economic growth measured by rising GDP, etc. If the value of STEM disciplines is by and large undeniably tangible, that is, that of humanities and social sciences, the former in particular is intangible, which is to say, not easily measurable. Right? So the STEM disciplines, their impact on society is tangible, is clear, concrete, measurable, whereas the impact and the contribution of the humanities in particular is much less so. In fact, it's doubtful whether it is tangible, measurable at all. But that doesn't necessarily mean not valuable. Okay? We can't equate measurable and valuable. I would argue, in fact, that the humanistic disciplines are essential to understanding the sources of social, political, economic, and environmental conflict today. Conflict that seems to be spiraling out of control, and that must be resolved if humanity is to, I think, have a future. And very much central to these conflicts are alternative and often incompatible answers to the question of how ought human beings to live their lives. This is what political philosophers call questions of the good life. In the Western tradition, broadly speaking, there have been two basic understandings of the good life, symbolized by which two cities? Possibly, that's an interesting thought. Well, symbolized by the cities of Athens on the one hand and Jerusalem on the other. The first stands for a life lived according to reason and what Plato called dialectic, and the other a life lived according to revelation. Although if one looks closer, the lines between the two are somewhat blurry, not least because the writings of the early Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle in particular, were taken up and appropriated by the church through the writings of figures like Augustine and Aquinas, respectively. So that line is a little blurred. And even if you look at Plato's own writings, they can't simply be understood as strictly rationalistic. They do have a mystical, transcendent dimension to them, which we could certainly go on to discuss. So the ethical question that addresses the nature of the good becomes politicized in various ways. State and non-state actors can and do seize upon these differences so as to exacerbate conflicts to their own instrumental ends. The humanities in general, and political philosophy in particular, can help us to bring the often implicit conceptions of the good life into view in such a way that the sources of conflict can be located and addressed. Right? This is one of those somewhat intangible but nonetheless very valuable contributions of something like political philosophy, which lies at the center of the humanities. My background and training is in political philosophy. Surprise, surprise. What unifies the humanities and some of the social sciences is the concern with broadly understood the interpretation of meaning. According to the great 19th century philosopher who had such an impact on Karl Marx, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, historically and intersubjectively constituted meaning lies at the core of a distinctively human form of life. In other words, what separates human beings from other mammals is that while the latter, by and large, simply desire objects, food and drink, and, of course, sex, human beings desire desire itself. In other words, human beings desire recognition from other human beings. Our identities are constituted through a process of recognition from the very first days of infancy, as object relations psychoanalysis tells us, looking at the early relationship between the mother and the infant. So this process of recognition starts very early, in the very first hours of our lives, till the end of our lives. Hegel's point is that one is only really a father, a mother, a son, or a daughter in the context of the family insofar as one is recognized as such. One is only an employee or an employer within the economy only if one is recognized as such. One is only a legitimate member of a political community, that is to say, a citizen, only if one is recognized as such. In the latter two examples, and this impinges on the first example as well, each of them have some relationship to the structures of law too. So recognition isn't just a subjective psychological phenomenon, but is one that becomes, as Hegel would say, objectified in forms of law. For example, the recognition of property, the recognition of such and such as the owner of such and such property. That is then understood legally. Right? So these forms of recognition play such a key role. So the role of meaning in human life is absolutely key. And this is what separates the human being from other forms of animal life. And we could list a number of different interpreters of Hegel's work, along with Marx, Jean-Paul Sartre, who I mentioned earlier, Franz Fanon, Axel Honneth, who's a German thinker, and more recently the indigenous scholar who's based at UBC, Glenn Coulthard. These are all people influenced by Hegel, in particular the idea of recognition. It follows that when different seemingly irreconcilable cultures meet, the difficult work of intercultural dialogue, interpretation, and translation needs to be done in terms of creating the conditions for genuine mutual understanding and mutual recognition. So recognition isn't just something that happens between individuals, within the family, within the scope of the economy, or within the political community, but it also happens between communities, between states, within a larger international framework. Right? So it's key that the work of mutual understanding, mutual recognition happens at this higher level as well. So the Frankfurt philosopher and Frankfurt School philosopher and musicologist Theodor W. Adorno describes the process of recognition in the following way, and I quote, and unfortunately I don't have the quote up on a slide to show you, but anyway, here goes the quote. "We become free human beings not by each of us realizing ourselves as individuals, according to the hideous phrase, but rather that we go out of ourselves and enter into relations with others, and in a certain sense relinquish ourselves to them. Only through this process do we determine ourselves as individuals, not by watering ourselves like plants in order to become well-rounded, cultivated personalities." Right? So the key thing is we truly become who we are, not in some Rousseauian state of nature where we're separated from everybody else and live in this perfectly authentic and free condition, but rather we truly become ourselves in our relations with one another. Right? We become who we are through our relations, through our dialogue, through our understanding, mutual meaning constitution with other individuals in different contexts. So as every diplomat knows, mutual understanding is a precondition to diplomatic and political alternatives to violence and conflict. Hegel's conception of individuals as constituted through relations of recognition has been understood along the lines of what the most important living Canadian philosopher, who is?
Charles Taylor.
Exactly right, Charles Taylor, calls a politics of recognition, which can be expressed in the form of a question, and that is, how is it possible for each of us to genuinely affirm one another's individual and collective differences publicly without misrecognizing, overlooking, or indeed denying them altogether? Is it possible, for example, to be recognized as a Quebecer and a Canadian simultaneously? If so, how might one balance a commitment to the Constitution, to the Charter of Rights, on the one hand, and reaffirm the specific goods, the importance of the French language in that province, for example, on the other? Alternatively, the central question with which we're seeking to grapple, with today, as not just today in this room, but today in our current situation in this country, is how can the historical injustices perpetrated against indigenous communities, particularly through residential schools, geared to so-called killing the Indian in the child be understood and acknowledged in such a way that may point towards genuine reconciliation between Aboriginals and non-Aboriginals under conditions of long eluded justice and equality. This is a key kind of question that we're confronting after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its findings. Perhaps the most pressing question that humanities and social sciences can contribute to answering, or let's put it this way, if not answering, then at least sharpening the question, is the following. How is it possible to understand the motivations that might lead young men and women to engage in the kinds of attacks that we've recently witnessed in Paris in the past year? And not just there. I mean, there are many such examples, and that is namely suicide bombing. This is simply not the kind of question that STEM disciplines are equipped to pose, let alone come anywhere near to offering a plausible answer to. This is not a question, in my view, that can be properly answered by evolutionary biology either. Again, the reason for this is because it involves this question of meaning, the interpretation of meaning, and the question of mutual understanding, mutual recognition, or the lack thereof. Right? So that's going to be key to my argument. Of course, one way of answering the question, or one way of understanding the attacks, is, of course, politically. That this is a response to the U.S.'s involvement in the Middle East since the first Gulf War in the late 80s, and more specifically, the toppling of Saddam Hussein, which has created a vacuum in Iraq and has intensified the confessional or the sectarian struggle between Sunni and Shia populations. One can also point to the clear double standard in the West's support of Israel as the quote-unquote only democracy in the region, etc. Moreover, many commentators have rightly indicated the manner in which the U.S.'s indiscriminate and frankly reckless drone attacks against supposed al-Qaeda operatives throughout the region have also played a key role in fueling the fire of Islamist anger, extremism, and radicalization. The argument, of course, is that the terror attacks are an attempt to open up a new theater in the war that has been raging in Iraq and now in Syria over the past 5 years. That the war could not indefinitely be confined to the Middle East, but would find its way eventually to Europe and North America. And 9/11 would be taken as a clear symbol of this opening of a new theater. And there is some truth to this. Daesh, the mocking Arabic name for ISIS, meaning those who trample underfoot, has emerged in the context of war and conflict and now embodies the aspirations to establish to reestablish the Ummah, or the community of believers within a single caliphate, kind of an Islamic theocracy that would serve to counterbalance Western power globally. However, what is often lost sight of in such an account is the specificity of the tactics deployed. There's been quite a long history of anti-imperialist struggles in the modern period. We can point to any number of them. For example, as the central one was it happened in 1857 in the Sepoy Rebellion against the British Raj. However, none have taken the current form, deploying a certain kind of terror tactics, namely suicide attacks. And hitherto unprecedented brutality that has had a spectacular quality to it. Namely, it is performed precisely for the Western media, which then help the group further disseminate terror, sort of like a vicious circle. In other words, it is necessary to explain the particular nature of the ferocity of the response that was absent in liberationist struggles, anti-imperialist struggles in the 60s and 70s, and even really in the ANC's struggle against particularly noxious apartheid regime in South Africa. So what is going on? Why do we see the predominance of suicide bombing type attacks? It is also important to recognize that the perpetrators of Paris attacks, as well as those of the London and indeed the 9/11 attacks were Western-born. The ringleader of the recent Paris attacks in November, Abdelhamid Al-Boud, was a Belgian of Berber Moroccan descent who, like the other attackers, grew up in the Belgian town of Molenbeek. Obviously, what comes into play is a profound sense of solidarity with Muslim brothers and sisters who are suffering throughout the world, as is repeated quite frequently. What such a view misses is the specific form the extremism takes, which is to say, it's a particular ascetic reading of Islam, no doubt deeply influenced by the strict fundamentalist Wahhabi interpretation of Sunni Islam that prevails in Saudi Arabia, with strict regulation of sexuality, that of women in particular, food, alcohol, art, and music. What we see in this interpretation of Islam then is an intensification of what Friedrich Nietzsche calls the ascetic ideals that lie at the heart of most so-called great world religions. So ascetic ideals, basically ideals of self-denial, denial of the senses, the denial of the body through different very rigorous regimes. For example, it's in the monastic order, vows of silence, etc., very austere living conditions and so on. However, it is not simply in the denial of sensuality that we find a manifestation of the ascetic ideals, but rather these ascetic ideals reach their logical conclusion in the complete obliteration of the body in the act of suicide bombing. Right? So the claim here is that the very logical conclusion of the ascetic ideals of all religions is the obliteration of the body as such. This is a simultaneous denial of the world of the senses and a mythological affirmation of the hereafter, in which the martyr will enjoy the company of 72 virgins and live forever in eternal erotic bliss. How are we to understand this phenomenon? Right? So this is also not just an Islamic story, but also can be found in Judaism, and certainly in Christianity. The idea that one lives a life of self-abnegation, of self-denial now, but one will then reap all the benefits eternally in heaven later. So this is a common way in which monotheistic religions certainly privilege the hereafter over the world that we can see, touch, feel, the temporal world that we are in presently. So it could be argued that what we see in the suicide bomber is a crisis of modernity that is highlighted by those who have been displaced and dislocated by the contradictory processes of capitalist globalization themselves. Now, these terms we can go into in the discussion period. We don't have time to sort of unpack them now, but we can come to those later. It's with these figures that I would suggest we see what I call a paradox between an empty liberal freedom on the one hand and the substantive idea of a meaningful or good life on the other. And this I'm drawing from the German sociologist Max Weber. He's the one who famously held that it wasn't as Marx argued, the contradictions in the mode of production that lead to social transformations, and particularly the transformation from feudalism to capitalism, as Marx held, but rather it was a particular kind of transformation in religious belief. So the Reformation played the key role in the emergence of capitalism. This is a so-called Protestant work ethic that drove the rise of capitalism. He was arguing directly against Marx. So what he's identifying then is this tension between freedom and meaning. And this is what Nietzsche famously called nihilism. By nihilism, Nietzsche meant that, quote, the highest values devalue themselves. Nietzsche argues that the old religious values cannot maintain themselves in light of their own contradictory imperatives. For example, the injunction to tell the truth, on the one hand, and the adherence to revealed truth on the other. This is clearly, at some point, a contradiction. The imperative to tell the truth leads to a logic of scientific discovery and innovation, which is directly in contradiction with the notion of adherence to revealed truth. The evidence of things not seen, and so on. Nihilism in the passive key for Nietzsche meant that few had the courage or fortitude to create new values, to fill the void left by the mechanistic worldview of modern science that destroyed the meaningfulness and purposefulness of life at the existential level. Really, at the beginning I talked about the ontological dimension, so this is what I mean. Life at the existential level or ontological level. And simply grasped the straws of religion in crisis after the death of God, which I just showed you that quote. Occasionally they would proclaim their belief, however, with particular fervor or enthusiasm. So that's also part of passive nihilism. Nihilism in an active key, however, and this is Nietzsche's own position, entailed the strength to bear the trauma of such a death of God, and to create new life-affirming values indexed to the sensuous reality and needs of the body rather than life-denying transcendence. He talked about that, or he identifies that in the quote that I showed you, right? We must ourselves become gods, right? That is to say, in the past, God had legislated values. God had, in a way, made the world meaningful. And we had passively adhered to those meanings. Now what Nietzsche is saying is that we ourselves need to create meaning. We need to create values for ourselves. Right? It's a kind of radical humanist sort of position. So Nietzsche himself drew the term nihilism from the Russian writer Turgenev, who himself was responding to anarchist bombings directed against the oppressive Tsarist regime in the context of Russia's own modernization in the last third of the 19th century. In Turgenev's novel Fathers and Sons, nihilism, personified by the figure of the materialist student Bazarov, his medical student, interestingly enough, and signified the reduction of nature, human emotion, indeed artistic expression, sensuous beauty, etc., to abstract mechanistic processes that came increasingly to be understood through the lens of naturalistic materialism. So Bazarov is a figure representing naturalism. The logical conclusion of such naturalism in Turgenev's view was a violent response to the old order, an attempt simply to destroy it, because it really served no purpose. Nietzsche here anticipates what many consider to be the meaning-destructive role of cognitive science today in reducing human mind, human consciousness, and ultimately human freedom to deterministic biological, biochemical processes occurring in the brain and in external nature. Terrorism represented in Russia an equally reductive response to the inequality and irrationality of the ancien regime, the old regime. So the idea of terrorism, in perhaps its earliest modern manifestation, was tied to a discussion of nihilism, interestingly enough. And this is something that really warrants a little bit more discussion. One way of understanding the problem of nihilism, as Nietzsche took it up, is in terms of this seemingly unresolvable tension or trade-off between liberal or negative freedom on one hand and meaning on the other. I already mentioned that, and I want to deepen that thought now a little bit. In the West, the formal freedom of the individual, which we, of course, we need to defend very fervently, very strongly, arises on the basis of a profound crisis of established orders of meaning that take their bearings from the revealed truths of the Abrahamic religions, what Weber would call charismatic authority, and also traditional authority. Things that are simply done the way they're done because they've always been done this way. Right? And we could also, look at other religious traditions, other contexts, such as the Indian one, which Hinduism has played such an important role, and you have the same kind of tension there as well. And a lot of those tensions are themselves actually playing out today. And we can talk about the Indian situation as well, where freedom of expression, freedom of speech, academic freedom are really under attack precisely because they challenge some of the basic nostrums of Hinduism, the caste system, and so on. So this was the idea that the world was inherently meaningful insofar as the world was in some way divinely ordained. An individual situated within these traditions had limited freedom, by which I simply mean the capacity to author her own fate, to write her own script, for a variety of sociological, metaphysical reasons. Yet her life was, in fact, full, perhaps all too full, of meaning. Right? So the old, again, in the Ancien regime, in the old order, life is very meaningful, but not very free. Life from its inception to its end, and indeed beyond, had a purpose that was often tied inexorably to conditions of labor, to social hierarchy, the notion of a great chain of being, etc. For the modern middle class, Western emancipated individual, the situation is exactly the obverse. As a result of what Eric Hobsbawm calls the Age of Revolutions from 1789 to 1848, the individual is progressively liberated from any kind of tradition that could be said to limit her freedom. Those with a certain level of affluence can choose from seemingly limitless sets of different ways of living one's life. And this becomes today difficult to distinguish from passive consumerism. Right? Now today we don't choose philosophically between different accounts of the good life. We simply choose different lifestyles to consume and to purchase and to consume. Right? This is our arguably what our world is today. And indeed, one can now, all other things being equal, even choose one's own gender and sexual identity with the aid of biotechnology, as a consequence of which meaning itself enters into a profound crisis. I'm not saying that these are bad things. These are very liberating things. I'm trying to say that this is how far liberation can go. And it does then create, though, questions of orientation, no pun intended, questions of how one lives one's life. That it seems that the traditions that had once oriented our ancestors, our grandfathers and forefathers and mothers, are no longer in place. And we're, in a sense, cut adrift. That offers two or many distinct possibilities, many different possible responses. People can take this as a real crisis. People can take this as a real opportunity. And so that, I think, question remains open. As the existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre famously stated in his lecture, Existentialism as a Humanism, existence precedes essence. We simply exist, we simply are, then we make of ourselves what we will, not the other way around. There is no pre-given telos that we must aim for or orient ourselves towards. We are left then with the difficult burden of fashioning ourselves rather than situating ourselves in larger meaningful contexts that transcend us, that precede us and will survive us upon our death. This throws some interesting light, I think, on the claim made by Westerners, citizens of the US in particular, and now coming back to the question of terror, that they hate our freedom. Well, it's not that they hate our freedom in particular, rather it is that the articulation of freedom in liberal terms, as it is a narrow conception of freedom that seems aimless, empty, and decadent to them. Whether we are condemned to freedom, as Sartre said, we do not live under conditions in which that freedom could be properly and meaningfully exercised. This is the liberal conception of negative freedom, the ability to choose in the absence of impediments, as opposed to the genuine capacity, what Nietzsche called the will to power, to participate in making meaningful decisions about our lives. Indeed, in creating new values. If our contemporary relativism makes all forms of life equally valuable, then none of them are valuable at all. Ennui sets in. This is perhaps what explains the attraction of the certainties of fundamentalist religion, but also right-wing populist movements that in the West are proving themselves increasingly attractive to growing numbers of people. This is how one can make sense of the phenomenon, for example, of Donald Trump. Many of his followers have been hit hard by globalization and are bewildered as a result, are enraged, and identify with Trump's apparent resolve and lash out against scapegoats who symbolize the sources of their misery. I'm just going to conclude in just a minute now. It is a seemingly unresolvable crisis that suicide bombers seek to resolve. Combine the crisis of meaning brought about through a perceived or vacuous, empty liberal freedom described above, with structural exclusion from the very possibility of redeeming some of the promises of material happiness and fulfillment that capitalism offers everyone, but actually delivers to very few. And with racism and neo-colonial realities in which young Muslim men experience humiliation, both on the global scale, but also in cities like Molenbeek and Paris and London. And you have a recipe for massive disaffection and ultimately radicalization. The suicide bomber seeks in vain to reassemble the broken unity of meaning and freedom in a single act of extreme violence. And it is in this act, and it is an act that is sure to beget more violence, both in Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, Afghanistan, as well as more reprisals on the streets of major Western cities on innocent Muslims, which itself will no doubt further fuel the fire of extremism. You see the vicious circle here. Today we clearly stand at a threshold. There seem to be only two alternatives. The first is a continuation of this vicious circle of more terror attacks under increasing militarization, the authoritarian undermining of civil liberties, through C-51, for example, and ultimately a kind of proto-fascism. The second is a strengthening of genuinely democratic forms of self-governance, in which new life-affirming, rather than life-denying values could be constituted. Thank you for your attention.